Since his debut at the Survivor Series in 1990, The Undertaker has been one of WWE's most reliable superstars in all of his guises. However, there is one era of The Undertaker's career that fans hold in highest regard: the era of the American Badass. In May 2000, at Judgment Day, The Undertaker returned from an 8-month hiatus by destroying the McMahon-Helmsley faction during a match between The Rock and Triple H. Roaring to the ring on a motorcycle, this was a very different Undertaker to what we had ever seen before. This was an Undertaker for the Attitude Era. A decade of destruction before him, as the WWE frequently like to point out, the American Badass hadn't come a moment too soon. 8 months earlier, the previous incarnation had been taken as far as it could go. As the leader of the Ministry of Darkness faction, he took great pleasure in crucifying his enemies on Raw each week, at a time when WWE was reaching peak silliness in the late 90s. The Deadman had been afforded some incredible and unbelievable storylines since his debut in 1990. He had risen from the dead after a loss to Yokozuna. He attempted to murder Mankind by throwing him off the top of Hell in a Cell, and he came face to face with his estranged brother Kane, who was presumed dead in a house fire in what was probably the greatest wrestling storyline of all time. Fans were willing to more than suspend their disbelief for The Undertaker, even more so than with other characters, so beloved and ingenious was the gimmick. However, by 2000, it was time for a change. The Attitude Era had matured, and the WWE's product felt more real than ever before. This WWE didn't have a place for the supernatural, so it was time to freshen up the greatest wrestling gimmick of all time. Mark Calloway himself admitted on Steve Austin's podcast that without the American Badass gimmick, he wouldn't have made it through the Attitude Era. So the small changes, the breaks at the right time, but I don't think I would have made it through if I hadn't changed when I did, to go to the American Badass. The character, I don't think, would have lasted through the Attitude Era. For Calloway, the change wasn't only necessary, but something to be relished. The Badass gimmick was totally opposite to the Deadman, yet Calloway fit right into the new role. The original Deadman gimmick restricted Calloway in terms of moves and physicality, but now this refreshed vision of the role allowed him to move around quicker and introduce new, high-impact moves like the Last Ride. Despite only lasting for 3 years, the American Badass era is what many long-term wrestling fans hold in highest regard. WWE was at a creative zenith when they introduced the revised character. You might have forgotten the incredible build-up to his return, featuring spooky vignettes on Raw and SmackDown each week. The gimmick was so good, nobody questioned why the change occurred in the first place. When the time came for the American Badass to debut, the crowd erupted. The long black coat indicated to the fans who he was, but things were very different to what everyone remembered. Chokeslam after chokeslam and a tombstone to Triple H punctuated the return of The Undertaker in one of 2000's most exciting and memorable moments. Later, we would learn more about this brand new Undertaker, an Undertaker for the new millennium. He was a lone wolf who answered to nobody, coming to the ring via motorcycle with Limp Bizkit blasting in the arena. The character had never been cooler and fitted the Attitude Era perfectly. The Undertaker was just cool and kicked ass. That being said, his feud with Kurt Angle was super entertaining. The Undertaker promised to make Angle famous during their clash, which became one of Undertaker's catchphrases for the era. The feud was memorable for Kurt swapping with his brother Eric during their match for the world title, allowing him to retain the belt. The Brothers of Destruction saw Undertaker team up with his brother Kane to win the Tag Team Championship, and The Undertaker defeated Triple H at WrestleMania. Granted, none of these feuds set the world on fire, but around 2001, nobody was, as this was the time that the invasion happened. Everyone can agree that the WCW-ECW invasion was a mess, and nothing much good came from the entire thing. The Undertaker naturally sided with WWE and destroyed any alliance wrestler that crossed him. DDP got saddled with a particularly lame gimmick as a heel stalker, going after the Undertaker's wife, despite being one of the biggest babyface stars in WCW history. It's fair to say that the American Badass gimmick is looked upon fondly, not for the feuds, but for the character itself. After the WWE had defeated the Alliance, the feud the Undertaker were about to embark on would be more memorable. However, they wouldn't occur without an unexpected and unwanted heel turn. The Undertaker did the unthinkable and assisted Mr. McMahon by forcing Jim Ross to kiss the boss's ass. The heel turn occurred for no storyline reason at all. The American Badass was still hot with the fans. It was one of the two botched heel turns within a year, the other being the unnecessary heel turn of Steve Austin. Hindsight shows that the heel turn did freshen up the Undertaker's act as he became Big Evil. The heel turn was useful somewhat as it gave a leg up to younger talent including Rob Van Dam for the hardcore title, both elevating RVD and the championship in the process, and, unbelievably, he allowed himself to be eliminated by Tough Enough winner Maven during the Royal Rumble. Soon after, it was back to business, with hot feuds against The Rock for the belt and an incredibly personal rivalry with Ric Flair that culminated in one of the best matches at WrestleMania 18. This legend versus legend dream match truly lived up to the hype as Flair brought his A-game to the Deadman in what was one of Ric Flair's last great matches. This was the 10th win for The Undertaker, and the streak was truly alive and well. In 2002, Big Evil went on to a Legends feud with Hulk Hogan and even helped Jeff Hardy begin his journey as a main event superstar. But before long, it was time for him to become a babyface again. Undertaker was drafted to SmackDown, once again refreshing his options by putting him in the same locker room as the likes of Brock Lesnar, Eddie Guerrero and Kurt Angle. 2003 saw Undertaker feud with John Cena, Brock Lesnar, Big Show and Albert of all people. However, this would be the American Badass's final year as he entered into a feud with Mr. McMahon. At No Mercy, The Undertaker had lost a match for the title against Brock Lesnar due to interference from McMahon. Paul Heyman was the new SmackDown general manager. He placed The Undertaker in a handicap match against Brock Lesnar and The Big Show with a stipulation that if The Undertaker won, he could choose any match he wanted. The Undertaker won and forced Mr. McMahon into a buried alive match at the Survivor Series as revenge. The feud got personal as McMahon stated that he would burn down The Undertaker's house and order The Undertaker's wife to be gang raped if Heyman didn't do anything about the match. During the contest, Kane interfered against his brother and helped McMahon gain the victory. Undertaker being buried alive, live on pay-per-view in the process. After the betrayal from his brother, it was time for the American Badass to take his last ride for a decade and a half at least. In an interview with Comic Book, Calloway admitted that the gimmick ended too soon. "I think we cut that off," Calloway said. "We cut that off kind of early when we did the American Badass the first time. I think we could have gotten a little more mileage out of it." By 2004 and the run-up to WrestleMania, the Deadman was back and would remain in this guise for well over a decade. Not until 2020 would the American Badass be seen in the WWE again. Back in the early 2000s, the American Badass came at just the right time for The Undertaker's character, a time when the business had moved away from traditional gimmicks, and a time when Mark Calloway needed the change, a chance to become unrestricted by the gimmick that had made him. In 2020, he needed the American Badass once again as he neared retirement, no longer being able to perform as the Deadman at the level he had before.